Welcome everybody to today's session of Liberty Books, and I notice there's one or two new faces here today, so I'll explain the format. Obviously there's sandwiches and fruit juice and coffee there, so help yourself to that, as I see most of you already have. We'll hear from, I'll introduce Julie in a moment. When we hear from her, once she's finished her actual talk, we'll take a short 5-minute break to enable people to sort of top up on the food and drink before we move into question time for Julie. So that's the format. As many of you would also know, this is the last of our series of Liberty sessions, which has, I think this is the 10th and final one of this session, and I think now almost all the previous ones are up on the IPA website, so if you've missed any of them, and they have all been very interesting, so if you have missed some of them, have a look at the website and catch up on any that you might have missed, because they do come up pretty well on the website. Now we're fortunate to have Julie with us today. Many of you would, I think Julie is probably just about the most prolific IPA person for getting in the media, probably only on a par with Chris Berg, I think. So Julie's, many of you will have read her work, and of course Julie has a background in treasuries, and most recently before the IPA with the Productivity Commission. And today she's going to be talking to us about Gordon Tullock's book, The Vote Motive, which I think came out in about 1976, and I think influenced a lot of people because it has the advantage, perhaps unlike some of the other books that we've done in these sessions, is being comparatively short and to the point, so it's probably fairly accessible for people. So without that, I'd like to welcome Julie. Thank you, Julie.
Well, thank you very much, Richard Alsop, for the warm welcome. Thank you very much for the opportunity to present this, the last in a wonderful series of lectures on the classic books in the liberal canon. Today I wish to speak to you about Gordon Tullock's famous primer on public choice theory, entitled The Vote Motive, originally published in 1976 by the UK-based free market think tank, the Institute of Economic Affairs. Before I delve into the details contained in The Vote Motive and some of its modern policy implications, I want to provide a brief account of the life story of Gordon Tullock, with a particular emphasis on his rather incredible intellectual journey. Gordon Tullock was born in the northern Illinois town of Rockford, about 2 hours' drive to Chicago and till Milwaukee, Wisconsin. His father was of Scottish ancestry and mother of Dutch stock. Unsurprisingly, the young Tullock excelled in schooling, and in 1940 was enrolled in the law school at the University of Chicago, which combined a 2-year program of undergraduate courses with a 4-year formal law program. Gordon Tullock, in fact, completed the initial 2-year program in a single year. And tellingly, this included a 1-semester course in economics taught by the great Chicago school figure Henry Simons. Tullock's tertiary education was interrupted by his drafting into military service as an infantry rifleman in 1943. As Tullock himself described it, his military career was unremarkable, which is arguably not a bad thing given the horrors of statist wars. Gordon Tullock returned to civilian life in late 1945 and returned to Chicago. He subsequently obtained his Juris Doctor degree from the Chicago Law School. After a very brief stint in a law firm, Tullock joined the US Foreign Service in autumn 1947, including a 2-year stint in China. He later returned to the United States, where the Department of State dispatched him to Yale and later Cornell University to study Mandarin. Proof positive, I guess, that thankfully not all Mandarin-speaking Westerners are unreconstructed Whitlamites. After additional assignments in Hong Kong and Korea, Tullock resigned from the Foreign Service in 1956. 2 years later, Tullock began his odyssey in public choice theory by accepting a 1-year postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Virginia. During this time, Gordon Tullock was largely preoccupied with writing a manuscript on the problem of majority voting in democracies, which later appeared in the prestigious Journal of Political Economy. Tullock also forged a ready bond with eventual Nobel Prize laureate in economics, James McGill Buchanan, resulting in some of the most important collaborative efforts in the rehabilitation of classical liberalism in the late 20th century. A year later, he moved to the University of South Carolina, where he published a draft paper called An Economic Theory of Constitutions. This piece became the basis for the all-time classic in public choice theory and constitutional economics called The Calculus of Consent, which was co-authored with James Buchanan. By this point in time, Gordon Tullock's academic career was in lift-off mode. From 1962 to 1967, he published important, if still underappreciated, works on bureaucracy and scientific methodology. He became the founding editor of the journal called Papers on Non-Market Decision-Making, which was later called the Public Choice Journal that we know and love today. In 1967, a famous breakout paper by Tullock on the phenomenon later dubbed rent-seeking was published. As most of you are aware, this is a process whereby economic agents seek to appropriate economic rent by manipulation of the public policy environment and other institutional settings, rather than by earning their own profits through the competitive free market process. I think the example of the carbon pollution reduction scheme is a very good example of the rent-seeking process at work. Over time, Tullock's academic work branched out into other fields of social and natural science inquiry. In 1971, Tullock wrote an article for the American Naturalist called The Coltit as a Careful Shopper. In it, he described the consumption of the North American eucocid moth larvae by the coltit bird, finding a pattern not unlike the standard supply-demand construct of economics. Because of this paper and others, Tullock is widely regarded as the father of bioeconomics, or the application of economic reasoning to biological phenomena. In 1978, Tullock co-wrote a book with public choice scholar Richard Mackenzie on the new world of economics. This book is something of a precursor to the modern Freakonomics style of publications, which describe the economic implications of such disparate yet everyday issues such as crime and punishment, family formation and marriage, and so on and so forth. For those who want to understand the sources of public sector growth, one cannot go past Tullock's 1975 article, Competing for Aid, and another Tullock-Buchanan collaboration called The Expanding Public Sector, Wagner Squared. Tullock is not only an intellectual innovator with seemingly instinctual flair, but by all accounts a fine economic educator. As many free market think tanks, such as the IPA, are aware, the key to effective economic education is to convey often difficult and counterintuitive theories and constructs in ways conducive to understanding by the everyday person. Sometimes this point seems to escape a great many academic economists, not Tullock, however. Tullock's awareness of and deft skill in explaining the complexities of the economics of politics in simple, easy to understand terms is perfectly illustrated, I think, by his public choice primer, The Vote Motive. As Tullock explains in the introduction to his book, public choice theory is an economic approach to studying political behaviour and the functioning of government. What distinguishes public choice from traditional political science or even welfare economics is the underlying assumptions made about individual behaviour in the political context. Traditional political scientists believed that actors in the political realm, particularly political representatives and government bureaucrats, always and everywhere acted to promote the public interest, however you wish to define that. Neoclassical economists, particularly around the mid-20th century, similarly viewed government as a benevolent despot that would faithfully and relentlessly determine and implement public policies that are in the best interests of the polity. The idea of the Samuelsonian social welfare function reflected the high watermark of this approach. As Tullock stated in The Vote Motive, public choice theorists had a different idea that harkened back to the early classical liberalism of Hume and Smith. Tullock said, government is seen as an apparatus, like the market, by which people attempt to achieve their goals. All the individuals in government aim at raising their own utility, that is, serve their own interests within certain institutional limits. The public choice approach described by Tullock, which rests on what I call the behavioural equivalence assumption, is, I argue, indispensable to understanding the political realm as it exists, and not by some romantic, high and mighty standard that cannot be attained by fallible, often self-interested humans. This is why public choice theory is both appealing and enduring. The Vote Motive walks the reader through a range of important applications of the public choice approach to political thinking. Tullock, for example, describes the average voter deciding between political alternatives at a polling booth as follows. Voters and customers are essentially the same people. Mr. Smith buys and votes. He is the same man in the supermarket and in the polling booth. He will choose the product or candidate he thinks is the best bargain for him. The beauty of this book and Tullock's overall work is that it rests on a simple common sense. A small business owner needing the taxing and regulatory burdens of government off his back will tend to vote Liberal and the like. A public servant who wants a career with more things to do at taxpayer expense will tend to vote Labor, or perhaps their political coalitionists, the Greens. Tullock then goes on to shed light on one of the long-standing puzzles of political science. If voting is used as a means to register the preferences of collective, as opposed to private decision-making, what kinds of outcomes might we expect? Assuming a given number of people voting on a single issue, say in a referendum, with well-behaved, self-interested preferences, the final choice, supported by a majority of voters in this situation, will be consistent with the preference of the median voter. In other words, the majority supported outcome will be that one which is smack bang in the middle of the distribution of all voter preferences. This median voter theorem is in fact a well-known result which assumes a place in the public choice literature to this day. This is one of the many examples, I think, of the durability of ideas contained in the Vote Motive. The beauty of Tullock's pamphlet also is that he doesn't begin and end at the simplest case example. He quite masterfully adds layers of complexity to enrich the analysis with an even greater sense of realism. In the voting scenario that I've just described, Tullock then adds political parties to the picture that effectively compete against each other to try to secure a majority vote from the public. However, citizens also vary by way of their intensity of feeling on certain policy issues up for a vote. What this really means is that the democratic process becomes messier than that described by the archetypal median voter theorem. Indeed, Tullock suggests that frequent errors are to be expected as political parties attempt to outbid each other in vying for political support. Sometimes parties overreach in ways inconsistent with the voting public and suffer a drop in their vote, while others more accurately read the tea leaves of voter sentiment and scoop the prize of public office. Despite this seemingly chaotic cut and thrust of political competition, Tullock states that democracy operates so that politicians who simply want to hold public office end up doing the things people want. While subsequent developments in public choice theory, including a greater appreciation of the possibility of fiscal illusion, Leviathan government, the role of special interests, and expressive voting behaviour, and off-budget government activities such as regulation, might put this statement under some sort of cloud, there is really no doubt that Tullock accurately and faithfully pays homage to the basics of public choice theory that any interested citizen would want to understand. One of the essential features of public choice theory has been the extension of economic principles to understanding the behaviour of government bureaucrats and other public sector workers. This strand of inquiry is certainly not a trivial matter, at least in the Australian context. ABS statistics show that the number of total public servants at federal, state and local levels, including workers in government trading enterprises, but excluding multi-jurisdictional institutions such as universities, have roughly grown from 1.36 million people as at February 2000 to 1.65 million in February 2008. The total public servants employed by governments have risen faster than the growth rates of both employment and working age population. And there is every indication that despite more recent federal, state and local promises to wield meat axes and the like, the public sector is continuing to grow out of hand. So we know that there are more bureaucrats and they vote. Tullock adds that bureaucrats are like other men. They will make the most of their decisions in terms of what benefits them, not society as a whole. Like other men, they may occasionally sacrifice their own well-being for the wider good, but we should expect this to be exceptional behaviour. The question immediately follows, what do bureaucrats aim to maximise, if anything, to try to obtain a greater state of welfare for themselves? Again, the vote motive invokes a broad notion of self-interest to provide an answer. In this case, a bureaucrat will find that his possibilities of promotion increase, his power, influence and public respect improve, and even the physical conditions of his office improve if the bureaucracy in which he works expands. If we follow the strict logic of neoclassical, self-interested maximising behaviour applied to government bureaucracy, we find ourselves in the unpalatable realm of the budget maximising bureaucrat, as outlined in William Niskanen's seminal book called Bureaucracy and Representative Government. Further, if the Brennan-Buchanan-Leviathan model of revenue maximising government, superbly portrayed in the 1980 book The Power to Tax, is simultaneously realised, then ordinary taxpayers face a most diabolical problem indeed. If government agencies and their workers are in a position to potentially persuade legislatures to approve appropriations in excess of voter preferences, what can be done to ameliorate the likelihood of service over provision, if not outright fiscal confiscation? The vote motive offers a number of solutions to reduce the potential for bureaucratic size maximisation. Tullock says, what is needed is some way of lowering the bargaining potential of the monopoly bureaus. Is there some way in which we can provide for Parliament the same ability to select the lowest price, rather than putting upon it the burden of determining the operating efficiency of the bureaucracy? The key here, according to Tullock, is to foster greater competition within the public sector. One option is to enable private companies to deliver currently provided governmental services on contract. The idea is that private companies can deliver services at significantly reduced cost. Tullock himself has hypothesised that industry can typically deliver services at half the cost of that under government provision. These services also tend to be delivered in a timely, effective manner and with the benefit of private sector innovation behind it. The empirical literature appears to confirm that this is indeed the case. Nonetheless, I shall revisit the issue of contracting out shortly. Another option cited by Tullock is to encourage more performance competition within the public sector. Assume that, say, a police service within a state is divided along geographic lines, with some variation in methods of law enforcement permitted. A superior, more cost-effective performance in Region A in one year might serve as a spur for other regions to emulate A's standards the following year. In the vote motive, Gordon Tullock approvingly refers to federal systems of government that provide for comparative yardstick competition between jurisdictions. This is an important issue that for some reason is not sufficiently appreciated by Australian political parties and business representative organisations. Indeed, it is particularly disconcerting that the appeal of efficiency-enhancing competitive federalism seems to be increasingly fading away from the Australian public conscience, if we were ever there in the first place. There seems little doubt that public sector reformers over the last 3 decades, the so-called neoliberal era, have been very much informed by public choice theoretical considerations. The influence of Gordon Tullock and other public choices have played no small role in the public sector management reforms observed across the Western world since the late 1970s. Contracting out of public services such as water supply, sewerage, garbage disposal, public transportation, major infrastructure projects, even policy advice has transcended almost into an art form. It is quite clear from hundreds of studies that contracting out various services has been beneficial on cost reduction and quality improvement lines. However, some economic liberals have expressed disquiet about the contracting out experiment. So, what seems to be the problem? Well, let's consider a few examples of public policy contracting to get some sort of picture. Since November 2007, the Rudd government has awarded $940 million and counting in 7,706 new consultancy contracts for policy advice, research and audits. The Allen Consulting Group, Boston Consulting, McKinsey and KPMG have been awarded contracts valued at over $80 million. Similar trends have been occurring at a state level. It has been recently reported that the Rand government in South Australia paid $500,000 for Boston Consulting to enhance strategy and policy development across the public service. Meanwhile, the Tasmanian government awarded contracts worth more than $25 million in 2008-09 without going to open tender. Now, the first problem raised here concerns the issue of value for money. Prior to the last federal election, Rudd Labor vowed to cut $3 billion over 4 years on what it described as wasteful spending on consultants. All three levels of government cited are wallowing in budget deficits, and South Australia is scheduled to cut 1,600 public service positions at the same time as Boston Consulting is being paid hard-earned taxpayers' money, including redistributed GST revenues from other states to deepen policy capabilities across that state's public sector. It seems that governments are expanding their core public services plus branching out into the world of receiving external policy advice. In other words, it is a fiscal double-up at the expense of taxpayers. Another concern relates to the accountability of such activities to the general public. A number of these contracts remain outside the public glare by virtue of commercial in confidence and other similar provisions. Taxpayers have no way of immediately assessing the efficiency or efficacy of these arrangements. Therefore, they cannot use the power of their public choices at the ballot box to turf out governments that engage in such activities, if they are at variance to their preferences. There's something more fundamental about this trend that is worth pondering. The service provided by a government contractor is decided upon by legislators or bureaucrats themselves. The revenue attained by the contractor is not by virtue of decisions by the consumer sovereign, but by political allocations. The services are not subject to a true profit and loss test, and so the contractor ends up serving the state and not civil society through free, competitive, private markets. As the free market American economist Tyler Cowen said in 2007, private contractors will respect the wishes of their most powerful customers, in this case governments. It is typically the case that rival contractors will also expend scarce resources in a contest to win a government contract. As Gordon Tullock has taught us, enterprises divert much of their entrepreneurial drive and innovative attention away from serving the private sector customer because of the rent-seeking game. Now, as I stated previously, there are certainly many studies that suggest that contracting out delivers costs and other benefits. But these cases pertain largely to tangible utility services, in which the snow of orthodox natural monopoly arguments have effectively withered away under the sunlight of technological improvement. So what about public policy development? Some commentators contend that contracting out policy work to the private sector diminishes the policy capabilities of the public sector. According to this view, there should be less policy contracting and more attention given to creating a clever, savvy public service. This idea so happens to be the subject of one of many Rudd government reviews right now. The argument expressed here may or may not be true. Regardless, I'm not attracted to the idea of giving government bureaucrats more sway with plans to tax or regulate away our precious economic liberties, or to encourage them to wastefully spend other people's money. Ultimately, the solution to this whole conundrum, in my view, is to actually privatise governmental functions, which would then allow for a reduction in the size of the public service and its workforce. If there are fewer issues for governments to worry about in the first place, there would be a greatly reduced need for bureaucrats, let alone policy contractors drawn in from the private sector. The option of outright privatisation is not given a substantial hearing in the vote motive, yet it really is difficult to fault Gordon Tullock for this, given his objective of introducing the basics of public choice theory to all and sundry. Indeed, in this respect, I'm of the view that Tullock delivers on this prime objective in spades. I want to conclude by referring to a remark made about Tullock by his old friend, the great James Buchanan, who labelled him as a natural economist. In Buchanan's opinion, a natural economist is someone with intrinsic talents that emerge independent of professional training, education and experience. A natural economist, therefore, is someone who more or less unconsciously thinks like an economist. Given that in so many ways, economic concepts seem so counterintuitive to untrained minds, Buchanan's comments about Gordon Tullock's natural abilities in this field come as very high praise indeed. During the height of the so-called Keynesian consensus in the 1950s, at a time when the light of classical liberalism appeared to recede into the darkness, the American economist G. Warren Nutter implored his colleagues to save the books. Friedrich Hayek went one further to commend that liberals should save the ideas. Gordon Tullock, with his pamphlet The Vote Motive, went even one step further, I think. He wrote the book to sell the ideas, and it took a free market think tank to help sell his ideas on political economy to the world, sparking an intellectual revolution of the likes rarely seen. This experience surely serves as a salutary lesson, if not a continuing source of inspiration for all lovers of freedom at this time. Thank you for your attention and Merry Christmas.